Snow fell like torn lace over Hollow Creek, swallowing the town in a hush so deep it seemed the earth itself was holding its breath. The barn crouched at the edge of the ridge, half buried beneath drifts of white, its roof sagging under the weight of another long winter. Inside, under the dim glow of a lantern, a young woman fought for her life, and for another's. Her name was Clara Wren. Her hands, slick with blood and trembling, cradled the newborn pressed to her chest. The child's first cry cut through the stillness, like a thread of light through dark cloth. Steam rose from her lips in shuddering breaths. She whispered a name, Lark, soft and trembling, then wrapped the infant in her torn shawl. The world was bone-cold and cruel, but the tiny bundle in her arms radiated warmth that felt almost divine. Yet even miracles can arrive too late for mercy. The barn door burst open, slamming against the wall. A gust of ice swept in, and with it came Eli Wren, her husband, his eyes glassy with whiskey, his coat flung open to reveal a pistol at his hip. "Well, ain't you been busy?" he slurred, stumbling closer. "Ain't no way I'm feeding two mouths now." She didn't answer. Her body was spent, her spirit barely anchored to it. He spat on the ground and stepped closer to the child. "Reckon there's men in town who'll pay fine for what's left of you." His laugh was short and cruel, the sound of a man whose soul had frozen long ago. Minutes later, Clara's world collapsed in the crack of a whip and the jangle of coins. She watched through a blur of tears as Eli haggled with a trader outside the barn. A man in a heavy coat, face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. The deal was made before she could draw another full breath. Her child was taken first, the infant's cry vanishing into the snowstorm. By the time they hauled Clara to Hollow Creek's market, the sky had darkened to iron. The wind howled down the narrow street, bending the flame of every lamplight. Townsfolk gathered, their boots crunching on the frost. Some came for trade, others for the spectacle. No one looked her in the eyes. They saw only a burden wrapped in rags, her hair matted with sweat, her arms empty. The trader barked her price, voice rough as gravel. "She's young, strong enough to work, has the face of one that could fetch a better life if someone's kind enough." Laughter rolled through the crowd, dry, heartless. Clara kept her gaze low, her lips pressed tight to stop them from trembling. A voice cut through the din, calm, level, heavy with something that didn't belong in that place. "I'll take her." And the child, every head turned. A tall man stood near the edge of the crowd, wrapped in a thick wolfskin coat. His beard was dusted with snow, his eyes the color of weathered stone. No one argued. The trader hesitated only long enough to name a price. Coins changed hands. The man nodded once, took the reins of his wagon, and motioned for Clara to follow. She did, her steps faltering through the slush. The man offered no hand, no word of comfort, only space. The child, bundled in a rough blanket beside the wagon seat, made a faint whimper, and that was the only sound between them as they left the town behind. The journey through the wilderness stretched endless. Wind clawed at their faces, the horses strained against the snow-laden road. Clara sat hunched, clutching the child to her chest, her fingers numb despite the shawl the stranger had tossed her way. She could not read his thoughts, nor did she wish to. Every kindness she'd known had come with chains. Yet something about him was different. His silence wasn't cruel. It was reverent, as if he were afraid of breaking the air between them. Night fell slow and violet. When the wagon hit a frozen rut, the baby began to cry, a thin, aching sound swallowed by the dark. The man halted the horses, climbed down, and without speaking began gathering wood. His movements were steady, sure. A fire soon flickered beneath a pine, the flames painting his face in copper and gold. He handed her a tin cup of warm water and his heavy coat, saying only, "Keep her close. The night bites hard." Clara wanted to thank him, but couldn't. Words felt too fragile, too small to bridge the chasm between them. Instead, she pressed the coat tighter around herself and the child. The heat seeped into her bones, and for the first time since her child's birth, she felt something like safety. By dawn, they reached a ranch perched on the edge of a frozen plain. The cabin stood weathered but strong, smoke curling from its chimney. A corral stretched beyond, horses stamping in the cold. The man led her inside without ceremony. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee. "You can stay till spring," he said, removing his gloves. "Then decide where you'll go." "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He paused. "Because no one deserves to freeze." Then he turned away, leaving her by the fire with the child. His name, she learned later, was Silas Boone, a rancher widowed 5 winters past, though the town whispered darker stories. Some said he'd lost his wife to sickness, others that grief had made him half ghost. He spoke little, worked much, and kept his heart locked away like a relic no longer needed. Days passed in a rhythm of quiet survival. Clara rose before dawn, fed the chickens, tended the horses, learned the way of the land by watching Silas move through it. He never looked at her long, never intruded, but his presence filled the silence like a heartbeat she could rely on. At night she sang softly to her daughter, her voice raw but sweet, blending with the creak of the cabin walls. Then came the gossip. Mrs. Temperance Crow, wrapped in her black shawl like a raven, appeared one morning under the guise of kindness. She brought bread, offered it with a smile too tight to be sincere. "The Lord sees all things, dear," she murmured, eyes scanning the room. A lone man and a fallen girl under one roof can stir tongues quicker than a prairie fire. Clara's cheeks burned. Silas, cutting wood outside, didn't look up when Mrs. Crow left, but he must have heard. That night, she found herself scrubbing the same pan over and over, tears mixing with the suds. She had done nothing wrong, yet shame clung to her skin like soot. The next day, while fetching water, she overheard Marshal Pike speaking with Mrs. Crow by the well. "Town's growing restless," he said. "Girl was sold, not freed. Could mean trouble if the trader comes back looking." "Best to send her away," Mrs. Crow replied, "before sin finds roots." Clara froze, the bucket slipping from her hand and cracking the ice below. She didn't wait to hear more. She fled back to the cabin, heart hammering. For hours she sat by the crib, watching her daughter sleep, wondering if safety was just another word men used before taking things away. That evening, Silas came in with frost on his beard. "Something's wrong," he said quietly, seeing her face. "They're coming," she whispered. "They think I belong to him still." "The traitor." He set his gloves down, the sound soft but deliberate. "You don't belong to anyone." The words struck her harder than any kindness had before. She wanted to believe them, but belief was a fragile thing. It needed time, warmth, patience, things she'd long forgotten how to trust. Winter deepened. The snow grew heavier, the nights longer. Yet within the small cabin, something began to thaw. When Silas fell ill with fever one night, Clara stayed by his side, cooling his brow with wet cloths, feeding the fire until her eyes burned. He murmured strange names in his sleep. His wife, perhaps, but when he awoke, the first thing he saw was her face, tired and gentle in the lamplight. "You're still here," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "Where else would I go?" He said nothing, only looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Not as a burden, but as someone alive, whole, unbroken. The following morning, she found a small carving by the crib, a wooden bird, its wings spread wide. She ran her fingers over its rough edges. "A wren," he said from behind her. Small things survive the storm. She couldn't speak. The gesture said what neither of them dared to, that in this cold, something new was learning to live. Outside, the snow began to soften, the air carrying a faint scent of thaw. The first hint of spring shimmered on the horizon, fragile but certain. Clara stood at the window, the baby in her arms, watching the sun fight its way through clouds. But behind her calm, a storm still brewed. She'd heard the marshal's voice again in town that morning, whispering of laws and debts. The trader was returning, it seemed, papers in hand, ready to reclaim what he'd sold. That night, after Silas had gone to bed, Clara lingered by the window. The world outside shimmered with frost, each branch coated in silver. She looked down at her daughter, sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, then out into the night where stars hung like cold lanterns. Maybe freedom wasn't a place. Maybe it was a moment, a single breath where you stopped running and chose to stand. The thought brought a calm she hadn't known in years. She tightened her grip on the child, felt her own heart steady beneath her ribs. Whatever came when the snows melted, she would meet it head-on. For the first time since that night in the barn, Clara Wren felt her pulse beat in time with the living world, and though she didn't yet know it, the thaw had already begun. The thaw came late that year, hesitant, like a secret afraid to be spoken aloud. The snow no longer fell but lingered in patches, shrinking into thin glass sheets that caught the morning light. Streams began to murmur again beneath their crust of ice, and the wind softened, carrying the scent of damp earth instead of death. But Hollow Creek did not thaw so easily. Rumors, once frozen by winter, began to move again, low, venomous, gathering shape as they reached the far corners of the town. Clara knew it before Silas said a word. She could feel the air shift, the way men paused too long when she walked by, the way Mrs. Crow's eyes followed her from the churchyard. She had gone into town for salt and flour, the baby strapped against her chest, her breath misting in the cold morning. The chatter stopped when she entered the store. No one spat words directly at her, but silence had a way of cutting deeper. On the way out, she caught fragments between two women near the porch. "The trader's come back. Says the girl's his by law. Marshal Pike's got the order." When she reached the ranch, Silas was already outside, chopping wood through the ground was soft with meltwater. His sleeves were rolled, his arms marked by scars she had never noticed before. He looked up and she didn't need to speak. He set the axe down slowly, his jaw tightening. "They're coming?" She nodded. He looked toward the road that led to town, where the horizon shimmered faintly with sunlight and threat. "Then they'll have to come through me." She stepped closer, her voice small but fierce. "You can't fight the whole town, Silas. You don't owe me that." He studied her, something quiet and steady in his gaze. "Ain't about owing. It's about what's right." The next day, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Marshal Pike rode up with two men behind him, the trader's wagon rolling close behind. The trader climbed down, the same sneer etched across his face as on that night long ago. His boots sank into the thawing mud. "Got papers," he said, flashing a crumpled sheet. "Woman was sold fair, baby too. You're keepin' what ain't yours." Silas stood on the porch, rifle resting against the post, though his finger never touched the trigger. "Ain't a thing on this earth that makes a person property." The marshal dismounted, his voice weary, not cruel. "Boone, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're a good man. Don't lose your place over someone else's mistake." Clara appeared in the doorway behind Silas, the baby in her arms, her eyes steady as the winter sky. "If mistake means being alive, then I'll keep it." The trader's expression soured. "You think talk changes law? I bought you, girl. World don't care how you feel." The words hit like stones, but Clara didn't flinch. She stepped past Silas, boots sinking into the mud, her breath clouding the air between her and the men. "You didn't buy me," she said softly. "You bought my silence. But that debt's been paid." The marshal shifted uneasily. Behind them, a few townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the noise. Mrs. Crow among them, her mouth tight as a purse string. The trader's hand twitched toward the child, and in that moment, Silas moved, not fast, not violent, just enough to step between them. "You'll not touch her." The trader snarled. "You think you can keep her from me, old man?" "I don't think," Silas said, his voice level. "I know." The marshal raised a hand, but one of the trader's men swung his rifle butt, catching Silas across the temple. He went down hard, mud splattering his face. Clara screamed and dropped to her knees beside him, shielding the baby as chaos rippled through the small crowd. Someone shouted, someone else cursed. The trader reached for Clara's arm, but before his fingers met her sleeve, she struck him with a flat stone from the ground. He staggered back, stunned. The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Blood trickled down Silas's cheek as he pushed himself upright, eyes burning with a light she had never seen. He said nothing to the trader, only looked at him, then at the marshal, whose gaze flickered with shame. "You've seen enough," Silas murmured. "Ain't no law worth breaking a soul for." The marshal's jaw worked, but he gave no order. The trader cursed, spat in the snow, and turned away. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "You both will." When they were gone, the crowd melted away too, their curiosity replaced by discomfort. Mrs. Crow lingered last, her face pale. She met Clara's eyes briefly before lowering her gaze and walking off without a word. Clara helped Silas inside. He was bleeding from the temple, his breath shallow but steady. She cleaned the wound with trembling hands, her heart pounding from what she'd done, from what had nearly been taken. "You should have let me go," she whispered, pressing a damp cloth to his brow. "And spend my days wondering if you made it?" His smile was faint, crooked. "No, ma'am. Couldn't stomach that." The fire cracked between them. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes like restless spirits. She fed him broth by the spoonful until his eyelids grew heavy. The baby slept in a basket near the hearth, her small chest rising and falling in the orange light. Clara sat awake long after the cabin fell quiet. She thought of the faces in town, the fear, the judgment, the silence. She thought of how close she'd come to losing everything again. Yet beneath the ache, something fierce stirred. A strength born not of defiance, but of belonging. Silas woke at dawn, pale but alive. The fever had broken. When he sat up, she was by the window, humming the lullaby she always sang to Lark. He watched her for a long time before speaking. "You could still leave," he said softly. "Spring's comin'. Roads'll be clear soon." She turned, her eyes bright in the dim morning. "And go where? Back to the world that watched me sold?" She shook her head. "No, I'd rather stay where I was seen." Silas rose unsteadily, moved toward her, then stopped, as if afraid to close the space completely. "You don't owe me." "I know," she said, a small smile breaking through the fatigue. "That's why it means something." They spent the next weeks rebuilding the fence by the pasture, repairing what the winter had taken. They worked in silence that needed no filling. Some days he spoke of his wife, how she'd loved the lilacs that grew near the stream, how he'd buried her there when the fever took her. Clara listened without jealousy, only understanding. Grief was another kind of love, one that never stopped speaking, even when the body was gone. As the days lengthened, green began to lace the hills. The child learned to grasp the air, to laugh at sunlight caught on the window. Life, fragile and stubborn, began again. But peace never lasts long in places where pride runs deep. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the plains, smoke rose from the far side of the ranch. Clara smelled it first, the sharp, bitter tang of burning wood, the barn. By the time they reached it, flames had already claimed the roof. The trader's wagon tracks were fresh in the dirt. He had returned for vengeance, not justice. Silas tried to rush inside, but Clara caught his arm. No, the beams will fall. The horses. We'll do it together. They tore open the doors, choking on smoke, the heat searing their faces. The horses screamed, eyes wide with terror. One by one, they cut the ropes, driving the animals into the open night. Sparks danced in the air like fireflies from hell. A beam cracked overhead, sending a shower of embers around them. Silas shoved her toward the door just as the roof gave way. The world became a roar of flame and splintering wood. Outside, she turned back in horror, but he stumbled out through the smoke, coughing, his coat smoldering. They collapsed together in the mud, the baby's distant cry piercing the chaos. The fire roared behind them, devouring what had once been shelter, work, life. Yet as Clara looked at Silas's soot-streaked face, she felt no despair, only clarity. Everything she had once feared losing was gone already. What remained was what no one could sell, burn, or own. By morning, only charred beams remained. The town gathered quietly, drawn by guilt or curiosity. It was hard to say which. No one mocked now. Mrs. Crow brought water. The marshal helped drive the last of the frightened horses back to safety. Even the wind seemed softer. Days later, Clara and Silas began rebuilding. The work was slow, but they did it side by side without bitterness. People from town started bringing wood, nails, food. The change was small, uncertain, but real, like grass pushing through ash. One afternoon, as they rested on the new fence, Silas spoke, his voice rough but steady. Didn't think I'd get to start again. Clara smiled faintly, brushing a lock of hair from her face. You didn't start over, she said. You just kept going. The baby toddled in the grass nearby, her laughter carrying through the air like a hymn. Silas watched her, eyes softening. She's got your spirit, he murmured. She's got both of ours, Clara said. They sat in silence, listening to the wind move through the grass. The world felt fragile, but also honest, built on labor, loss, and grace. Later that evening, when the stars came out, Clara stood outside the cabin, her hands folded around a mug of coffee gone cold. She looked at the wide sky, the smoke from the rebuilt chimney curling upward like a prayer. Behind her, Silas hummed a tune, low, unsteady, but familiar. The song of the wren. She turned toward him, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind. Thank you, she said. He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the faint starlight. For what? For letting me stay. He smiled then, small and genuine. Wasn't my choice, Clara. Was yours. She stepped closer, the distance between them closing like dusk meeting dawn. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't needed to say. Somewhere beyond the hills, spring began its quiet work. And if you listened close, you could almost hear the old soul telling it. The story of a woman once sold to winter, who found warmth not in being saved, but in being seen. If this story warmed your heart, subscribe for more Wild West tales.